Paul Bernardo has been selected as one of the notorious serial killers in Canadian history. Although he committed a series of rapes in Canada between 1987 and 1990, with at least 12 rapes and 4 attempted rapes, he was also involved in at least 3 murders. But he wasn't really a serial killer. He was a lustful demon made by an acquired influence. Paul Bernardo was never cut out to be a killer. It was just his perception that was altered in the home environment he grew up in. A person's upbringing determines what kind of person they will become in the future. An example of this would be if your father was a carpenter, then over the years you might also be interested in carpentry as a career. Paul Bernardo was born into a very bad family. His mother, Marilyn, and was adopted at a young age by a lawyer from Toronto, Canada. The family loved Marilyn so much that they always treated him well. But growing up in this coddled environment, Marilyn would think that everything was perfectly fine, so she meets her husband, Kenneth Bernardo, who grew up in another unfortunate family. Kenneth's father was a successful businessman, but he was not a good father or husband, because whenever he had a little setback in business, then he would beat his wife and children. As a result, Kenneth got into a bad habit, which is that he would treat young women with a morbid mentality. In 1960, Marilyn's boyfriend asked her to marry him, but her father refused because he had failed the so-called son-in-law test. But even the most successful people make mistakes. Marilyn's father had put Marilyn in Kenneth's trap just because Kenneth had passed the son-in-law test. Marilyn and Kenneth married in 1960 and settled in a middle-class neighborhood in the Scarborough area of Toronto, Canada, a beautiful community, but Marilyn and Kenneth's marriage was not a good one. They fought, and Kenneth would beat Marilyn just because he was like his father. Kenneth, like his father, would bully his wife whenever things didn't go his way. Marilyn was a very naive person who thought that she would be happy by going along with Kenneth, but she was proven wrong. Even after she gave birth to Kenneth's child, Kenneth didn't stop his bad behavior. Eventually, Marilyn ran away from the marriage. She cheated on her ex-boyfriend and gave birth to a child, but Kenneth was not repulsed by Marilyn's behavior. It didn't even matter to him. He tolerated Marilyn's infidelity and volunteered to be the child's biological father on the birth certificate. In August 1964, they named the child Paul Bernardo. And while Paul was growing up, his father, Kenneth, continued to harass young girls. He would hang out in the neighborhood at night, tailing young girls and peeking out windows to watch them change clothes, for which he was taken to court. But the worst was when he began sexually abusing his young daughter. And Paul's mother, Marilyn, who became self-absorbed because of her husband's beatings as well as her mind control, would overeat to the point that she became very obese. And because of her obesity, her depression became worse, so she stopped taking care of her family as well as her children, and instead hid herself in the basement of the house. And Paul lived in such a bad environment. He was originally a very friendly little boy who was happy every moment. Especially when he smiled, he would have dimples. So much so that many women would unconsciously pinch his cheeks every time they saw him. And to them, Paul was just a very perfect child. Because Paul was polite and did well in school, especially when he was very cute in his Boy Scout uniform. Later, as he grew up, Paul would keep attending events, so he was the favorite in the hearts of the kids around him. Teenage girls also adored him because of his angelic appearance and shy, likable demeanor. The girls who dated Paul when he was in high school also thought Paul was a very considerate person. Intellectually, Paul was even better. He was smart, worked hard at his studies, and took on a number of school positions to take care of a range of after-school tasks. This was Paul's happiest time until, at the age of 16, he got into an argument with his mother, and Marilyn angrily said to Paul, "Who do you think you are? You're just an asshole, and you're not your father's real son? After Paul saw the picture of his real father, his mind went blank, like a bullet hit his brain. After this, Paul's thoughts changed, and he began to mock his mother, calling her very sloppy and even saying that she was a whore. Because Paul realized his mother's unfaithfulness and his father's sick behavior, he began to hate his parents. So Paul started to hang out with some bad boys, and this had a very negative effect on his thinking. Paul followed them and stole and bullied girls together, and after this, Paul's attitude towards women changed dramatically. Before, Paul would treat the girls gently and considerately, and after this, he would order them to do something bad, and if they didn't agree, then Paul would verbally abuse as well as beat them. Around 1980, Paul graduated from Sir Wilfrid Laurier College. Paul and his friends were recruited by Amway, an American marketing company. And Paul learned a lot from this job, such as sales and business aspects and interpersonal relations. He also bought a lot of books and tapes from famous experts. At this time, Paul was all about making money, but it didn't last long. Paul left Amway after working for a while. When Paul stayed with his punk friends, they would go to the bar every night and drink. If there were some pretty girls who were attracted to their douchebaggery, they would lie to those naive girls that they were rich. And this lie would attract those naive girls, and then they would voluntarily sleep with Paul and the others. By the time Paul was studying at the University of Scarborough in Toronto, his mind had become distorted, and his temper had become so violent that he would seek out gentle girls for dates, humiliate them in public, and beat them up when he was in a bad mood. Paul also sells stolen goods. His friends rob passers-by in stores, and then Paul sells them at the university. Because Paul's desire for money is so powerful, no job's paycheck will allow him to squander it. So Paul starts a scam in which he swears to get a lot of money, but luckily no one is fooled. By the time Paul graduates from college, Paul takes a job as a junior accountant in order to make ends meet. And his girlfriend, tired of being tied up and beaten, breaks up with Paul. Paul, who was initiated by the girl to mention the breakup, felt angry because he was a controlling macho man, so he began to decide to take revenge on society. On May 4th, 1987, a 21-year-old girl was followed by Paul while she was riding a bus home late at night. She was walking alone on a late-night street, which was illuminated by streetlights as the girl made her way home, but Paul attacked her for half an hour. It was Paul's first attack and a nightmarish experience for the girl. On May 14, 1987, as if Paul had tasted a delicacy, he attacked a 19-year-old girl again, and the place of commission was in the backyard of a house. The girl panicked and called for help, but no one rescued her during that hour or so. On July 27, 1987, it was as if Paul was obsessed with the feeling of the girl's constant struggles and cries beneath him. He tried to carry out a third attack. Paul found a girl by the side of the street in the middle of the night, who was preparing to go home. He first assaulted the girl, trying to get her to follow him, but after the girl fought back, he got scared and then gave up the attack. On September 29, 1987, Paul again attempted to assault a 15-year-old girl by being so bold as to break into the girl's house illegally and then quietly enter her bedroom. The girl was sleeping, but Paul woke her up by sitting on top of her, and when she tried to cry out for help, Paul covered her mouth with his hand and then took out a knife and threatened the girl. And sensing something was wrong, the girl's mother, she entered the room and found Paul. Then when she was about to scream out loud, Paul fled. In October 1987, Paul met the girl of his dreams, a beautiful blonde called Carla Homolka, 17 years old, and in that year Paul was 23 years old. When they meet, it's like Cupid's arrow has hit them both because they almost immediately take an interest in each other. Unlike the girls Paul had met before, Carla was totally supportive of Paul's idea of assaulting others and was totally okay with being abused by Paul. Carla was born in 1970 in Port Credit Hare, Ontario, Canada, to Karol Homolka, a traveling salesman and Czechoslovakian immigrant with a penchant for heavy drinking, and his wife, Dorothy Homolka, an employee of a geriatric clinic. She has two sisters, Lori and Tammy. Carla is a bright child and a good student, and her father loves her, but he also insults her and her mother and sisters when he is drunk. Almost all murderers will have an unfortunate family, a father who likes to beat his family and a mother who doesn't love her children. Living in this type of environment, Carla's temperament was also influenced by her father, and she became stubborn and overbearing, unable to get along with other children, yet she would socialize with people older than her, and this was a sick mentality because she enjoyed being abused. When Carla was in middle school, she experienced a depressive episode, and during that time she would dress in strange costumes and then hurt herself with a knife, and when she was caught by her parents, she would say, "I hurt myself just to get your love." During this time period, she had gone down the wrong path, and unfortunately, she didn't get any help from anyone. When Paul and Carla became a couple, Paul drove to see Carla twice a week and slowly took control of her entire life, deciding how she should dress, look, eat, and believe. Especially because Paul was so upset when he found out Carla wasn't a virgin when they first met. Paul's sarcastic comments about Carla being fat and ugly may have been compensatory, but Carla soon succumbed to Paul's mind control, even writing down Paul's instructions on a self-improvement checklist. When Paul and Carla are together, they role play, with Paul playing the role of a master and Carla playing the role of an abused slave. During the time that these two demons spent together, more than a dozen girls were attacked by them. On December 16, 1987, Paul again attacked a 15-year-old girl. The following day, the Toronto Police Service issued a warning to women in Scarborough, particularly those riding the bus, because they had noticed that the girls were being followed after they got off the bus. On December 23, 1987, Paul attacked a 17-year-old girl again with a knife, threatening her with disfigurement if she wouldn't take it. And from this attack, Paul began to be known as the Scarborough Rapist. On April 18, 1988, a 17-year-old girl was attacked by Paul. On May 25, 1988, Paul was almost caught by a uniformed police officer as he was about to attack a pretty young girl. However, he was spotted by the policeman, and even though he was hiding under a tree, Paul immediately fled after spotting the policeman. On May 30, 1988, Paul again attacked an 18-year-old girl. On October 4, 1988, Paul again stalked a girl, but this time he was not successful because the girl was prepared and she bravely fought with Paul, but because Paul had a knife in his hand, she was stabbed twice by Paul at her thighs, as well as at her buttocks. Luckily, she didn't die, but only received 12 stitches in the wounds. On November 16, 1988, an 18-year-old girl was assaulted. On November 17, 1988, the police formed a task force to capture Paul. But despite a wealth of physical evidence and sketches of the killer that were not shown to the public, the investigation came up empty. And Carla knew what Paul was doing in the meantime. One of the victims claimed that Carla was present at the attack and recorded it on video camera, but the allegations were ignored by the police. On December 27, 1988, Paul's attack failed because a nearby neighbor chased Paul away at that time. On June 20, 1989, Paul's attack failed, and it was another brave girl who struggled with Paul before her screams, caused a nearby neighbor to run away with scratches on Paul's face. On August 15, 1989, a 22-year-old girl was attacked. On November 21, 1989, Paul attacked a 15-year-old girl at a bus shelter. On December 22, 1989, Paul assaulted a 19-year-old girl. On May 26, 1990, Paul again attacked a 19-year-old girl. After so many victims appeared, the police published sketches of the killer in Toronto and the surrounding area and provided a great deal of information in order to prevent any more victims. Between May and September 1990, police collected DNA test samples from more than 130 suspects when they received 2 reports that the killer they were looking for was Paul Bernardo. The first was submitted by a bank employee. The second was submitted by the wife of one of Paul's closest friends, who told police that Paul had been set up as a suspect in a previous assault investigation, but that he had never been questioned and that he would often talk to people around him about his sick ideas. And when the police received this report, they weren't sure if they were going to take it seriously, but after examining both reports, they decided to question Paul. On November 20, 1990, the police formally questioned Paul. When the police mentioned Paul as to why he was being investigated, Paul admitted that it was suspicious that he looked like the killer's sketch. The police then concluded that they thought it was unlikely that such a well-educated young man would commit a crime, and Paul volunteered to give blood, saliva, and hair samples. And the interrogation, which lasted 35 minutes, ended with the police ruling that Paul was not the murderer. After the interrogation, Paul and Carla got engaged, and to celebrate this special day, Carla did something that outraged everyone. For she volunteers to give Paul her 15-year-old sister's virginity as a Christmas present. However, Paul is also very happy with this offer. Paul hatches a plan where he asks Carla to use drugs to knock out her sister Tammy that night, and also asks Carla to make sure that Tammy is a virgin at all times. Carla does a great job. She acts like a strict father and forbids any boys to come near Tammy. In Tammy's mind, she thinks that Carla is being nice to her, but the truth is, what she doesn't realize is that Carla is actually treating her like a commodity. Then, on a summer trip, Carla is ready to make her move, stealing a lot of sleeping pills from Tammy's workplace in order to knock her out. That night, she cooks a meal and puts some sleeping pills in it. After eating, Tammy did fall asleep, but only for a minute. On December 23rd, after Christmas dinner, Carla put a handful of sleeping pills in Tammy's drink, and the amount would put a cow to sleep. By the time Tammy started complaining about why her head was so dizzy, Paul and Carla had a strange smile on their faces because they knew in their hearts that the plan was about to be executed. And a few minutes later, Paul got the result he wanted. And Tammy woke up from the pain, but just as she was still thinking, Carla took a halothane-soaked rag and covered Tammy's mouth and nose. Tammy struggled with the pain and she kept trying to vomit. Carla continued to cover Tammy's mouth, and after a few minutes, Tammy stopped breathing. After Paul and Carla realized that Tammy had stopped breathing, they tried cardiac resuscitation, but it didn't work. Tammy was dead, so they set out to eliminate the evidence. They dressed Tammy and put her body in her bed. Because as soon as the autopsy was done, the coroners would realize it was a murder. So they disguised the scene as an accidental death. Then they called the police and claimed that Tammy choked to death on her own vomit. When the police arrived, although they noticed mysterious chemical burns on Tammy's face, the drugs in her system were not detected, and believing that the family would never murder a family member, the police concluded that Tammy's death was an accident. At Tammy's funeral, Paul did a very disgusting thing. He kept touching Tammy, who was lying in the casket. They even put a picture of them in the casket. 3 weeks after Tammy's death, Carla and Bernardo filmed a video called Fireside Chat at the Homolka residence. The video was ultimately considered as evidence in court because it began in the basement recreation room, and at some point the filming moved to Tammy's bedroom. While they were in the recreation room, Carla admitted to Paul that she liked it when Paul attacked Tammy, and she also said in the video that she wanted to leave a rose at Tammy's grave. In Paul and Carla's subsequent role-playing sessions, Carla would even dress up in Tammy's clothes to play the part of her poor sister. Paul was a demon of sexual desire, and Carla was like a believer who was voluntarily compelled by the demon. Shortly after Tammy's funeral, Carla's parents leave town and her other sister, Lori, goes to Mississauga to visit her grandparents. The house was empty at this time, just Paul and Carla, so they decided to do something about it. On January 12, 1991, a beautiful weekend, Paul went out hunting early in the morning, and a few hours later, a girl was kidnapped and brought home by Paul, who then attacked the girl while Carla watched. On April 6, 1991, Paul continued his attacks, this time in St. Catharines, Canada. At approximately 5:30 a.m., Paul abducted a 14-year-old girl. This attack was different from the previous one because Carla was also involved in the attack. The girl was in training at the time, but Carla kept waving at her from her car. When the girl approached, Paul immediately grabbed her and dragged her to a bush on the side of the road and attacked her. On June 7, 1991, Carla invited to the party a 15-year-old girl known as Jane Doe, a friend whom Carla had met 2 years earlier at a pet store. During this time, Carla had been taking Jane shopping as well as eating, after which she took Jane to a bar for drinks. When Jane got drunk, Carla immediately called Paul and asked him to come over and help bring the girl home, as Jane was Carla's wedding gift to Paul. By the time Jane woke up the next morning, she felt sore and weak, but she didn't think it was strange because it was her first time drinking. She just thought it was a side effect of being drunk and didn't realize in the slightest that she had been attacked. And Jane's story with the couple didn't end there. In August, she was once again invited by Carla, and then once again she was knocked out and once again attacked. On December 22, 1992, Jane visited the couple once again, and this time Carla forced her to have sex with Paul, after which she left distraught. Leslie Erin Mahaffy, one of the 3 victims murdered by Paul and Carla, was born on July 5, 1976. She was born in the United States of America. Her father was an oceanographer with the Canadian Federal Department of Fisheries and Oceans and was sometimes away from home for weeks at a time. Her mother, on the other hand, was a teacher. On the evening of June 14th, Leslie went to the funeral home to attend the wake of her friend Chris Evans, who had died in a car accident earlier in the week. After the wake, a group of teens met in the woods to comfort each other. A couple of her friends gave her a ride home just before 2 a.m. and decided to stay with her when they realized the side door was locked. Leslie told them the front door would be open and let them go home. But when Leslie realized that the front door was also locked, she walked to a payphone in a nearby plaza and called her friends to ask for a place to stay, which was denied. After a lengthy conversation, she said she had to go home to wake her mother to get in. On her way home, she met up with Paul, who was in the backyard looking for the victim. After learning that Leslie did not have a place to stay, he lured Leslie back to the car and took her to the house he shared with Carla. Later that day, a friend of Leslie's called Leslie's parents to check on Leslie and explain to them that Leslie had been locked out. Leslie's mother immediately began searching for her daughter, but of all places there was no sign of Leslie, and then on June 18th she filed formal papers requesting that her daughter be notified and arrested as a runaway. What she didn't realize, however, was that her daughter had already been kidnapped by Paul, and all the police could find was her body. During the first 24 hours of Leslie's abduction, Paul and Carla continually beat and assaulted Leslie and gave her a teddy bear to cuddle in between attacks. However, during Leslie's torture, her blindfold fell off and she clearly saw Paul and Carla's faces. So Paul kept strangling Leslie with wires and Carla used sedatives, just as they had done with Tammy's murder earlier, and Leslie died from their torture. Paul and Carla then moved Leslie's body to the basement. During this time, they host Carla's family at their home for Father's Day dinner. When the family leaves, they dismember the body with a circular saw, but that's just not enough. They think the best way to dispose of the evidence is by hiding the body in cement. So the next day, Paul bought a dozen bags of cement at a hardware store. Several trips were then made to Lake Gibson, 18 kilometers south of Port Dalhousie, to drop off the cement blocks. On the evening of June 29, 1991, a man and his wife were canoeing on Gibson Lake when they saw a block of cement while some pieces of meat were wrapped inside. Then, with the help of a fisherman, they pulled the cement block out, and upon closer inspection, inside the block was the calf and foot of a young woman. Soon the place was buzzing because they called the police. And the police found a total of 5 cement blocks dumped in shallow water. Police reasoned that whoever dumped this body in Gibson Lake was unfamiliar with the area, or he would have thrown the cement blocks under the bridge. The body was also identified as Leslie, who had been missing for days, as her distinctive braces provided a clue. On July 28, 1991, after Paul saw 21-year-old Sydney Kirshen while driving home from work, he followed her. He continued to follow her until August 9th. This time, she took evasive action, stopping at her boyfriend's house just before he arrived. Upon spotting Paul, the boyfriend gave chase, saw Paul's gold Nissan, and memorized the license plate. The couple identified the car as belonging to Paul to the Niagara Regional Police. An officer visited Paul's home and saw the car parked in the driveway, but did not pursue the matter or file an official police report. On the afternoon of April 16, 1992, Paul and Carla were still searching for potential victims. It was after school the day before Good Friday. Students were still heading home, but in general the streets were empty. As they passed Holy Cross High School, a major Catholic high school on the north end of the city, they noticed Kristen French, a 15-year-old student, walking down the street. The couple pulled into the parking lot of the nearby Grace Lutheran Church, and Carla got out of the car, map in hand, pretending to need help. While Kristen was concentrating on the map, Paul attacked from behind, brandishing a knife, and then pushed her into the front seat of their car, where Carla took control by pulling Kristen's hair from her back seat. Kristen would take the same route home every day, taking about 15 minutes to get home in order to satisfy her dog. When she didn't arrive home when she was supposed to, her parents became convinced she was in danger and immediately notified police. Within 24 hours, the Niagara Regional Police had assembled a team that searched the area along the route and located several witnesses who had witnessed the abduction from different sides, thus providing the police with a fairly clear picture. Over the course of 3 days over the Easter weekend, Paul and Carla videotaped themselves torturing Kristen and forcing her to drink copious amounts of alcohol to make her obey Paul's orders. And since Paul has long had it in his mind to try to kill her, and since she's never been blindfolded, and she remembers exactly what her kidnappers look like, Paul has no intention of letting her go from the start. The next day, the couple murdered Kristen before going to Easter dinner, when Paul strangled Kristen with an electric wire for a full 7 minutes before letting her die, while Carla watched on, and when Kristen resisted, Carla would beat her with a rubber mallet, and ultimately Kristen died as a result of their torture. On April 30th, 1992, Kristen's body was found in a ditch in Burlington, approximately 45 minutes from St. Her body had been cleaned and her hair had been cut off. The medical examiner found bruises on Kristen's back similar to the blunt force injuries on Leslie's body, and for the first time, police connected the two murders. Police then questioned Paul again on May 12th, based on clues about his propensity for violent and aggressive behavior, and considered him a prime suspect in both Southern Ontario murders. The Niagara Regional Police, in cooperation with the Halton Regional Police, formed a task force to investigate both crimes. On July 21st, a reenactment of Kristen's abduction was shown on television. It generated thousands of tips, but no substantial leads. On January 6, 1993, Carla was admitted to St. Catherine's General Hospital after she had been severely beaten by Paul with a flashlight, whereupon Carla accused Paul of assaulting her with a weapon. The police then arrested Paul, but he was soon out on bail, and Carla never returned to her and Paul's home in Port Dalhousie. A month later, the Forensic Science Center finally matched Paul's DNA from 2 years earlier with Scarborough Rapist DNA, and tests proved that Paul was Scarborough Rapist. After being notified, the police placed Paul under surveillance. Carla was initially uncooperative with the police, and after consulting with her lawyer, she said she would testify against Paul on the condition that she be granted immunity from prosecution. The Attorney General of Ontario did not agree to immunity, but was willing to consider a reduced sentence. On February 17th, Paul was arrested for the murders of Leslie and Kristen, as well as crimes committed by Scarborough Rapist. At first, the police interrogated Carla for 4 days. She blamed Paul for Tammy's death. She described how Paul abducted Leslie from the yard and how she and Paul lured Kristen to the car in the parking lot. She stated that both girls were used as slaves before Paul strangled them. It was also claimed that Paul had bragged to her about attacking at least 30 girls. Carla described herself as a battered wife who was forced to participate in Paul's crimes and lived in fear of him. When police searched their house, they found lists of Scarborough rapes, books of a perverted sexual nature, a hunting knife, handcuffs, and a videotape of Homolka and Bernardo engaging in sexual activity with 2 unidentified young women. So, in the eyes of the police, Carla was clearly a willing participant in both encounters. She admitted to the police that one of the girls had been drugged, and that she was later unaware that she had been assaulted. On July 6, 1993, as part of a plea bargain with prosecutors, Carla was convicted after pleading guilty to 2 counts of manslaughter in the murders of Leslie and Kristen. She was sentenced to 2 12-year prison terms to be served immediately. On the news, Carla appeared as Paul, a co-conspirator, not a scared, forced participant. Jury selection for Paul's trial began on May 1, 1995. The Crown opened its case on May 18th. The trial lasted 4 months, during which time Carla spent 17 days on the witness stand in the courtroom. Paul was found guilty of all charges against him: 2 counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, being held captive, and aggravated sexual assault, and 1 count of defilement of a human body. He was sentenced to life in prison and declared a dangerous offender with a high likelihood of parole. 5 years later, in 2000, both the Ontario Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court of Canada rejected Paul's efforts to appeal his murder conviction, and in 2006, Paul's lawyer indicated that his client had confessed to 10 other sexual assaults in 2005. He has been incarcerated at the Millhaven Maximum Security Prison in Bath, Ontario, since 2013. And while the government's investigation into Paul found that the police had made many mistakes and that competition between police agencies further compromised the investigation, some of Bernardo's crimes might have been prevented if his DNA samples had been processed and matched more quickly. Paul was treated differently by all inmates in prison because he was a serial rapist. For Paul's protection, he was kept in the segregation unit of the prison, but despite this, he was attacked and harassed. On one occasion in 1996, he was punched in the face by another inmate as he returned from a shower. In June 1999, 5 criminals attempted to break into the segregation perimeter where Paul was housed, and a riot squad had to use gas to disperse them. In 2006, Paul was interviewed in prison, stating that he was reformed and would be a good candidate for parole. But looking at the terms, he was ineligible for release in 2010 because he was convicted of multiple murders. He then had his last 2 parole hearings in 2021 as well as in February of this year, but was denied both. Karla Homolka, on the other hand, served her entire 12-year sentence before being released from prison in 2005 under a series of conditions imposed by a judge, including restrictions on her movements and a ban on contact with anyone under the age of 16. Just a few months later, another judge overturned those restrictions, which drew criticism from Leslie and the Kristen family. After her release, she moved to Montreal and has been married and has 3 children. Some reports indicated that she was volunteering at a private school, but this news caused resentment and concern among some parents when it broke in the media. Despite this, the school authorities stated that they were aware of Karla's past and that there were always other people present when she interacted with the children, ensuring that there was no chance of being alone. Furthermore, Karla later moved with her family to the Caribbean island of Guadeloupe and lived under the name Leanne Bourdley, the brother of her prison lawyer. After being discovered by a Canadian journalist, she returned to Quebec. Despite the fact that she has been out of prison for many years, her past continues to generate a great deal of public interest and controversy.